This slide series is done in memory of Dr. Edward Ross Ritvo, who passed away in June of 2020 at the age of 90 years. A pioneer in autism research, he led the field in establishing that autism was neurobiologically based. A graduate of Harvard and a U.S. Army veteran, he spent his entire academic professional career at UCLA. His work included studies of diagnosis and classification, genetics and epidemiology, as well as neurobiology and psychopharmacology. He trained generations of leaders in the field and is survived by family members and many, many students. It's an honor to dedicate this series of talks to his memory with the support of Dr. Ariella Riva Ritvo Slifka and the Alan B. Slifka Foundation.
Welcome to this professional educator training series called Communication. My name is Dr. Barbara Cook, and I'm from the Department of Communication Disorders here at Southern Connecticut State University. Before we get started, it will be helpful for me to share some of the terminology that I'm going to reference a little bit later in the presentation. The first is called scripted speech. This is repetitive phrases used in a variety of situations that may not have variation from situation to situation. Many of the times we think of scripted speech as when an individual will repeat lines from a movie. And while this is certainly a part of scripted speech, here I am more thinking about those phrases that an individual learns, that they're comfortable with, that they use with little variation from setting to setting. The second terminology that you should be aware of is called pedantic speech. We use this to talk about individuals who tend to use an overly formal grammatical structure that's really not appropriate to the conversation. We can have children use pedantic speech, but we also can have adults who are in a more relaxed conversational environment who tend to still rely on these over-formally grammatical structures. The other terminology is Gestalt language. Most of us begin learning language through a Gestalt, meaning that we learn it through a bigger picture, whole chunks of words. But as our language develops, we begin to be able to compartmentalize and categorize the different vocabulary concepts that we're learning. Some individuals struggle with this compartmentalization and may always learn language in a Gestalt manner. That means that they will learn an entire chunk of a word. For example, maybe they learn that they prefer to drink lactate milk. And so they would say, "Mom, I want the lactate milk," and never really know what lactate is. So certainly that can happen for many of us, but it helps to represent this idea of learning the chunk phrase rather than the individual words that could have been generated, self-generated, if you will, and put together to make that statement. The last set of terminology is called echolalia. Echolalia is the term that we use to refer to language that consists of repetitive words, phrases, or sentences that initially don't appear to serve a communicative purpose, but on observation, we begin quickly to recognize the purpose of communication that is being used by the individual. There are two types that typically occur. The first is immediate. That is when a person imitates immediately following the conversational partner. So for example, I might say, "Do you want a drink of milk?" And the individual repeats exactly with that same intonation and prosody, "Do you want a drink of milk?" So it can be difficult to determine what the function or purpose is of that immediate repetition. The next type is called delayed echolalia. This is when the individual can be in an environment, so maybe they're in the kitchen and suddenly says that phrase, "Do you want a glass of milk?" So it's clearly imitated from a prior time with the conversational partner and used in a similar setting or context, but you can see the unusual nature of the person saying, "Do you want a glass of milk?" When in fact, what they really might be trying to say is, "Can I have a glass of milk?" So, in today's session, my goal is to provide for you highlights of the communication skills that we frequently see in children who are preschool, 3 to 5, in school age. So, I'm really encompassing elementary, middle, and high school here, and adulthood. Being able to describe that terminology I just talked about, and also recognizing the unexpected types of communication that might be observed across these settings. And then I will conclude with 5 strategies that you can use to support the communication of any individual, regardless of their age, in the process of helping to support their language and communication development. Let's start with this case study. This is Jasmine. Jasmine is a 4th grader with autism who speaks in complete sentences that appear to be repetitive and scripted. So this could be an indication that she has some echolalia. Although she can read and answer concrete comprehension questions, so this would mean after reading, if I say, "Where did Billy go?" and she can respond correctly to what the story tells us about Billy, that maybe Billy went to the park. So she can respond, "Billy went to the park." However, Jasmine continues to rely on Gestalt language. So remember before, that means that she's continuing to rely on the larger chunks of information that she learns rather than the discrete, isolated vocabulary. One of her challenges is retrieving words to express confusion and a lack of understanding. When this happens, she reverts to and uses scripted questions such as, "When will I have lunch? Do I have speech? Do I have recess? When will I see Mr. Pinto?" So in this place of her failure to retrieve words and express confusion, we see a little more of this repetitive scripted speech. So as I go through the developmental patterns for communication, I want you to think about Jasmine and think about the areas that might need to be addressed for her in developing her communication. So it's always a great place to start with, what is communication? I think that we all have our ideas, but let me give you a little bit of additional ways to think about communication. And then hopefully to think about how you're supporting students who have challenges with that ability to communicate. So I always think of communication as 2 people, 2 or more people, who are having a message that they're sharing with one another. And when we think about this dyad, this model, we always think of us functioning at one point as the sender of the message and the other person, our partner, as the receiver of the message. But of course, as you know, it's not static. It's not a one-way system, well, most of the time. It's really supposed to be circular, right? So one minute I'm the sender, and the next minute I'm the receiver. So it helps to think about what happens when you're the sender. What is it about you and your skills that allows you to generate an idea to share with someone else? Well, first of all, you have to have the thought or the idea, right? So you have to have some knowledge of some concepts. And then typically, we're going to have vocabulary words. We're going to have a grammatical structure to put those words together to share with somebody, right? So we have a symbolization, if you will, a way to convey to others this idea or thought that we had. And we'll use words. We could use gestures, as I'm doing here a little bit. We also can do proximity, right? So I can change where my body is in space to help to support the sending of that particular message. But there's something else important, and that is I have to take the perspective of the receiver, and I have to make sure that whatever modality I use to communicate, the receiver will understand that and be able to accept and respond to this message that I send to them. So what does the receiver need to do? Well, the receiver needs to be able, quite frankly, to receive the message. We call it reception. And we always think about hearing, right? We have to be able to hear the person speaking, but we also have to be able to see. Remember, a lot of our messages, I believe it's actually 80% of the meaning, comes from our facial expressions, our gestures, right? Body proximity. So it's important that the individual can both see and hear. That's why it's so critically important for us to understand the sensory systems of individuals and what information they can receive in order to understand what's happening around them. The receiver also then, though, needs to go to the next level called comprehension. So they not only have to be able to hear the words spoken, as you're hearing me speak to you now, but you also have to have the capacity to take those words, process them, understand what they mean, make meaning with them in order to respond back to me. And so within this model of communication, we also have a critical feature known as the feedback system. So you can see that little arrow going from the receiver at the bottom back to the sender. That feedback mechanism becomes the manner with which we're doing a check. It's really accountability. So are you understanding? If I send you a message, unfortunately, in this module, I won't know if you're understanding me, right? In a face-to-face, I could quickly pick up on any gesture or comment that you make to me as the sender that would allow me to know how well my message is getting through to you, how well you're understanding and interpreting the message that I'm trying to send. So the feedback back to the sender gives the sender the opportunity to revise, to restate, or to continue. So when you think about individuals with autism, it's really important to understand that for them, the breakdown in communication can be at any one of these junctures. They may not have had the experiences to be able to develop a thought or idea. They may not have the linguistic knowledge receptively to attach language symbolic meaning to the concept. They may not have the words, the gestures. They may struggle with the appropriate body proximity. They may not be able to speak. So whatever their modality of communication is, might need to be supported. They may have all of these components of being able to identify ideas, but then as a receiver, potentially they have difficulty with processing visual information, auditory information, putting it all together to make sense. And then, of course, they may have difficulty not only providing feedback to the person who's sending them the message, but also interpreting that feedback from others. So as you work with this population, it is really critical to recognize which of these areas, and it can be multiple, is really influencing and interfering with the communication for the individual. I spoke about modalities, and I want to take a pause and just say, we always talk about speech because speech really is considered that kind of shared primary modality. However, if you think about all the ways in which you communicate with others, you'll recognize quickly all of the items on this list. You use gestures, You wave, you point, you use facial expressions, you use body proximity. You might get really close, you might get too far away. You use vocalizations. Right? So sometimes we even forget about the vocalizations that we use that communicate some very clear messages. And I wonder about some of the individuals you work with and what kind of vocalizations do they use that really have meaning, and we're not really focusing on what that meaning might be. And of course, speech, reading and writing, which is really an outflow of speech, right? It's an outflow of language. And then, of course, sign language. A note about sign language is that it's important for everyone to understand that as it says, it is a language. So yes, it uses hand gestures, arm gestures, and some facial to communicate a message. And it's important to understand that it is a language that has rules. And so while on the surface, it could appear that using sign language could be a good alternative for speech, it isn't always, because the individual still has to be able to conceptualize language, meaning they have to understand words and they have to be able to express words in some form other than speech. And sign language would require that. So let's take a look through the age groups that I've divided up. And let's just take a look. What can a 3 to 5-year-old do? So yes, of course, their primary mode is speech. However, they're using every mode I talked about, and some are even using sign language, right? It's very common for parents nowadays to incorporate a little bit of sign into their language communication with their child. So a 3 to 5-year-old is speaking in complete sentences. And when I say complete sentences, so noun, verbs, adjectives, nouns, right? Subject, predicate, all those English language concepts that we learn. They're speaking in complete sentences. They have 1,000-word plus vocabulary. So they have this explosion of knowledge that occurs from age 3 to 5. From a pragmatic perspective or social communication perspective, they're using communication for a variety of functions. They're requesting to meet basic needs. They're directing, so they recognize the influence and the ability to ask people to do things for them. But they're also informing, right? They are telling about themselves. A preschooler will come home and tell about what they've learned when they were in preschool, maybe even talking about what happened at the water table, for example. And they're sharing, right? A 3 to 5-year-old really wants to tell you all about them. So this is also the time that their perspective taking is starting to be established and be developed. So this group of individuals who do not necessarily have a diagnosed disability are not always going to take perspective, and the conversations are going to be all about them. However, they are informing, they're sharing, and they're engaging in turn-taking during conversation. They can anticipate when it's their turn. They've learned the dance of that social interaction. And they do a lot of initiating, not just responding. And lastly, this part is important because it really prepares the child, and it would be a rationale as to why we start to teach reading or have children go to school at the age 5 to 6. And that is, by 5, a child can tell long, engaging narratives. They can tell stories about their personal experiences. They can retell stories that their parents may have read to them. They'll pick up a book and they'll tell you they're reading. They're not reading the words necessarily, but they're recalling the story and they're telling the story. So you can see that from age 3 to 5, there is a significant growth in language to support communication. So, what happens with individuals in this age group, 3 to 5, to their communication that might allow us to recognize that they're going to need some support? So, number one, there won't be sentences necessarily, it'll be primarily phrases. If there are sentences, we might recognize the individual as having a more pedantic type of structure. In other words, maybe too much formality than you would expect from a 3 to 5-year-old. In fact, some historical documents would say that there are some individuals in this age group that people will say they talk like little professors. So, kind of to help to give you a visual of what that pedantic type speech might look like. There also can be echolalia, as I mentioned before. It could be immediate or delayed. So if we think of our case study, Jasmine, when Jasmine was in this 3 to 5 age range, there may have been very little generated language and primarily echolalia. So Jasmine might have said, I'm hungry. I'm hungry, to mean I want a break, I want to go play, I want to eat, but not always necessarily meaning that she wanted to eat. You'll see a limited vocabulary or vocabulary that is primarily based on the individual's likes and interests. So there won't be a lot of flexibility in the vocabulary that you see. From a pragmatic perspective, you will see primarily requesting and directing of people using communication, but very little sharing information, sharing emotion, or that interaction that's just for social interaction. Usually, there will be some ability to respond to direct questions or comments, but not questions or comments that are complex. And as I said, little to no sharing of experiences. Let's take a look at what the relevance is to these areas of communication, expectations, and then the challenges you might see for individuals with autism who would be in a pre-K or a kindergarten, first grade classroom, as this is the expected setting for a 3 to 5-year-old. Think about the greetings with the peers and teachers. What kind of language communication would be expected? Is there a formal expectation, informal language expectation? So, for example, perhaps to say hello to their peers, it might not even be a hello, it just might be Bobby, versus to the teacher, it might be a little more formal. Hi, Mrs. Smith. Then think about, throughout that time in that setting, what kind of sharing and responding would have to happen, especially within the class lessons. What kind of communication language could be expected during peer play? And then finally, what kind of language communication might be needed for lunch recess interaction? So if you can think about the skills that we use to communicate, and then think about the setting that those skills would be required in, it can help you to start thinking about what kinds of communication you might support for an individual with autism. For the next two groups, I'll be doing the same thing. I'll talk about expected communication behavior, unexpected communication behavior, and then ask you to think again about what are the typical settings in a school environment that those populations might be in, to then think about what's the vocabulary, what's the expected grammatical sentence structure, if you will, that would be used, and then what are those expected social ways of using communication. So for school-aged individuals, We're moving beyond just speaking in sentences, and we're moving to complexity of sentence, very similar to how I'm speaking to you now. So a school-aged individual is going to begin to utilize varied forms to link ideas together. They're also going to be expanding again astronomically on their vocabulary. So they're learning about words that can have multiple meanings and how to use those words in different contexts to convey those multiple meanings. They're going to learn about lexical ambiguity and figurative language. What do I mean by that? So lexical ambiguity has to do with the way in which we use language to not always be clear about what we mean. So for example, I might have a very simple direction, and the direction could tell students that I want them to read up to chapter 9. Because of the ambiguity of the phrase up to, some of the individuals may infer that to mean to include chapter 9. Others might infer that it does not mean to include chapter 9. Our students typically, through experiences and incidental learning, begin to learn the nuances of this ambiguity. Or, more importantly, they're able to then use their pragmatic language to ask, what did that mean? Can you be more specific? Can you clarify what it is you want us to do? And then, of course, figurative language is that language that is trying to make our world, I would say, a little more exciting, a little more flowery, right? So, we all have the classic, it's raining cats and dogs. And we don't literally mean that, but we say it in a way that really helps us to more fully express what's happening outside, right? So I could say, it's so sparkly out right now. Well, I hope that you would infer that that means that it's very sunny. And I can tell you that it also happens to be a snowy day. So the sun and the snow together is making it very sparkly. At this level, there obviously is using language to request, direct, and inform. However, this is also when communication and the language that we use to communicate is increasing in its purpose for learning, right? We use the term heuristic, meaning that we are trying to gather information to know more about more things. So it's really in this school age level that this development of language is so critical to learning, right? And to academics. The two are truly intertwined. We also can see, again, a continuation of conversation capacity, the ability to anticipate turns, to initiate. We also, though, see a shift in the ability to have conversation in larger groups with more people and to really engage in the dance and the back and forth of having these social interactions with multiple people, and also picking up on the nuances of groups. So what topics can I talk about with my peers in seventh grade, let's say outside right before track practice, versus the conversation I can have with my seventh grade peers in my history class in front of my teacher. So these are some of the nuanced things that happen with the conversation and the understanding of what can and cannot be spoken about. Narratives take on a more reflective approach and reveal the ability for the individual to take perspective. So I want to pause and appreciate that what I'm sharing for you in this slide is really the perspective of the growth of language to support communication that occurs from about first, second grade, all the way through 12th grade. So while I want to appreciate that range that I'm referring to, I also want to share that for each individual, this is a constant growth and shift. It very much directly connects to the academic experiences. the social experiences, the engagement in community activity, in clubs and school, etc. And so the ways in which an individual will get from to these higher levels, if you will definitely be varied. However, provided there is no interference, so whether it be neurological or environmental, every student will come to this capacity eventually to this by the time they're in 12th grade for sure. So I want to, again, talk about this narrative component and the reflection and ability to take perspective. So when a person is telling a story, much as I'm trying to share a story with you about communication, I have to make some adjustments to consider the perspective of the people who are listening to the story. And so the same holds true for school-age individuals. And so you can imagine, the more I read, the more I learn, the easier it might be for me to take perspective and to share stories. And then lastly, a critical component is how we use gestures, our facial expression, our body position, and how nuanced it becomes. This is fleeting. We can very quickly express a feeling, emotion, opinion, and before we know it, it disappears from the person's face. So we quickly learn how to pick up on those nuances as we're interacting with each other. So what's unexpected in the school age? What are some of the typical challenges that we see? So we will see some sentences, but that perhaps lack complexity. Sentence structures that maybe are not, we're not combining and creating more complex sentences, but still rather more typical brief sentences. Echolalia or pedantic forms certainly can continue. And for many individuals with autism who have overlying communication challenges, this echolalia can persist. And it speaks to the likelihood that they're just alt language learners and that it will be hard for them to shift to becoming more generative language learners, meaning that they are a person who generates language tends to have developed file systems, if you will, of all of the content and knowledge that they have and can generate their sentences as they're thinking about the idea that they want to convey. The vocabulary will be problematic in that it will, again, tend to highlight interest, but also focus more on concrete. So vocabulary that can easily be represented visually, whereas vocabulary that has a more abstract notion might be difficult, might be more difficult for individuals to comprehend and to understand. Very frequently in the school age population, there can be challenges with movement in the functions of communication, so the reasons for which students communicate. So a focus really has to be on how are we helping students to use communication to socially interact, to gain knowledge, to inform others, right? And also, how do we expand interest? How do we take areas of interest that an individual has, allow that communication and conversation around those interests, and then how do we expand upon them? How do we offer opportunities for individuals to engage and learn language for other areas of interest that then could potentially link back to their current personal area of interest? So notice that there's some shifting in the context of schools that we want to think about in supporting communication. So in this elementary, middle, high school level, we are always going to have greetings, right? And farewells. We're always going to have sharing and responding in class. But some of the shifts are going to will require more of the student's ability to both ask and answer all kinds of questions. So higher order, so who, what, where, when, but now how and why, to reveal inferencing and understanding. And certainly there is always lunch and recess interaction, and the communication that's required for academic learning. We really need to think about how we are providing individuals with the vocabulary and the concepts that will support them to be more successful in these academic areas. And then, of course, clubs and activities. Our primary focus has been schools and school age. However, many of you will also be working with individuals who fall in that 18 to 21-year-old range. And it's important that we think about, what is communication for an adult? What does it look like in adulthood? It's really not significantly different than we would expect at that end of school age, right? So we're using speech, gestures, expressions, body language more competently, more flexibly. We may be more aware and observant of how we speak, or the language that we use, the words that we use, the phrases that we use, our gestures. We're going to expand our vocabulary, right? So the most amazing thing about communication and the learning of language is that the brain continues to learn. So years ago, we used to think that the brain was plastic, that learning ended at a particular point in time. Well, I can tell you, I'm testament for that to not be true, since I did not get my most recent degree until I was 52. But we also have evidence with individuals who have an acquired disorder. So individuals who might have some kind of a car accident and have traumatic brain injury, or have a stroke, and result in something that we call aphasia. What we learn is that there can be some recovery and there can be continued learning. So it's important, as we think about our population of individuals with autism as they move into this adulthood space, that their capacity to expand the vocabulary, to expand on the functions that they use to communicate, maybe even to negotiate and persuade, to develop close relationships, is possible. We only need to just remember that if their communication consists of the forms I show here, so phrases or sentences that lack complexity, if they're still using echolalia, or they're more pedantic, or their vocabulary appears to be limited, we can provide support and have knowledge that there is opportunity for continued growth in these areas of communication. It's so important, it's so critical, right? Because as you can see, across the lifespan, initiating and responding, sharing and responding, answering, asking questions are always relevant, right? Sure, we're going to shift. Well, we're still going to have some academic learning in adulthood, but now there's a shift to this workplace engagement. But remember, engaging in clubs and leisure, that happens all along the way. And that also can help individuals be successful in using communication and engaging in the workplace and environment. The workplace environment. So as you think about communication, think about vocabulary, the words that people use, the meaning that they're trying to convey, and then take a pause and ask yourself, how perfect does that phrase or sentence have to be? Or is it more important that we think about the communicative intent, the reason for that phrase or sentence, and can the people in the environment of the individual understand and engage? I'll use that example of the child who says, "Do you want a drink?" If the child goes to the refrigerator and looks at their mother and says, "Do you want a drink?" and the mother can interpret that as the child asking for something to drink, sure, we want the mom to model maybe a more acceptable or more easily interpreted way to say, "I want a drink." At the same time, we don't want to discourage communication, and we want to accept those opportunities to communicate from the child. So, what are some things you can do that, to accept communication, to train, to model? So, these are 5 steps that I feel are critical that you can use for all individuals. The first is referred to as wait time. We are in a hurry, we're in a rush, and frequently we do not give the individual time to process a request that we've made, or for that matter, the child might come up to us and we don't give them time to initiate, right? Remember the model of communication, they have to process and formulate the idea. So allowing time for processing is critical. And even working on a plan for some wait time between prompts, right? Between providing support, giving space for the individual to be able to make those ideas and accommodations for their speech. Tied directly to wait is listen and observe. What is the context? What's happening around you? What possible reason could the individual have to communicate? Right? And then think about, watch, observe, listen. What words have they said? What gestures have they used, or facial expressions or body proximity that collectively could give you the clue into what it is they're trying to communicate? Again, are they trying to share a message or respond to your message? Once you have figured it out, once you know, so once I know that when Mary goes to the kitchen by the refrigerator and says, "What do you want to drink?" and I know she really wants to say, "Can I have a drink?" I can now set up the stage to model the correct or the expected way of asking for something to drink. So I can go next to Mary and I can look at Mary and I can say exactly what I want her to say. So I might say, "Can I have a drink?" Right? And wait. If she says it, I'm going to open the door and get her a drink. If she doesn't say it, I have another option. I could have a visual support, right? I could have already known that I'm trying to have her say, "Can I have a drink?" instead of, "What do you want to drink?" So I could show her a series of pictures, or maybe even the written sentence if she can read. Lastly, if I say, "Can I have a drink?" and she doesn't say it, so the modeling doesn't really help, the visual support doesn't result in her saying it, because my expectation is speech in this moment, I can certainly encourage her to say the word, right? I can teach her how to repeat me and to say what I want her to say. So let's go back to our case, Jasmine. So you may remember, Jasmine was having difficulty experiencing aspects of her day. And when she had difficulty, she would ask those series of questions. So we've determined that what's happened with Jasmine is that 2 things. She's really not understanding the tasks that have been presented to her in that moment. And so instead of saying, I don't really know what you want me to do, I need help, she refers back to this scripted of questions to try to tell us that she wants to move on, quite frankly. And so here's what we do for Jasmine. We show her a schedule of the day, right? Because we want to make sure that this isn't a case of anxiety over not knowing what's coming. And so we show her that schedule with the pictures. We tell her the plan. We have her go through the plan. And then we go back to the activity and we reflect, what is it about the activity that she doesn't understand, right? We try to think about the situation and why she's confused, right? So we're doing the waiting, listening, and observing. And then we model. We say, I don't understand and I need help. And then through that same process I showed you before, the ideal would be that she modeled that from me. Then I can offer her a visual and have her point to pictures or even read a sentence that says, I don't understand and I need help. And then, of course, we can provide a verbal prompt. The key to having any of this work is responding to the communication attempt. It is so important to prioritize communication, not the form, not the word, not the structure, but that Jasmine is trying to tell us something and that we're figuring out what it is she's trying to tell us and we're responding to her in an appropriate way. So in this instance, it would be giving her more support in that activity that might have confused and overwhelmed her. Thank you for listening and engaging in this presentation. I'd like to share that there will be additional presentations that you can access, and we invite you to visit our website. We always welcome your engagement and your support, and contributions can be made through our website. Once again, thank you for listening